I'm sure we're going to get some people jumping in a little later, but we're at the hour, so we're going to get going here. This is Frankie Leonardi. I'm president of the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. We've got a real packed schedule with a lot of information from Jim Bokern, our local historian. We will be recording this presentation and we will be making it available on our YouTube channel later this week. So if you can't stay around for all of it, or you know someone who wasn't able to join us this evening, we'll be pushing information on the video's presentation via our Facebook page. We ask that everyone please stay on mute as we go through the presentation so we don't have any background noise, and it makes for a better presentation and a better video recording. You can use the chat box to send questions. I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation. I probably will just hold those questions until the end, unless there's something that seems timely to interrupt Jim on. And then at the end, when if we have time, we'll ask you that you can unmute and ask any questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jim Bokern to talk about moonshining in the Northwoods.
Hey, thanks, Frank. And I'm letting people in here, and it's so good to have all of you on board. And what is really going to be promising an exciting experience, chasing after a research thread that was started 13 months ago. And I've been chasing this thread, and it has just built and built and built. And you are going to be getting a lot of information. I kind of apologize in advance. We may go over an hour. But I have so much information and so much sharing from so many different communities. I really want to get it all out there and get it out on Zoom, because this will create, I'm sure, more feedback and more stories going forward. So the presentation itself is going to start out with me doing a bit of context, because you have to understand the structures around moonshining in the Northwoods. There are a lot of elements and influences. And then I'm going to dive in and largely do a geographical arc throughout different parts of the Northwoods, and finish off with a big story of extortion and people getting machine gunned and all that. And that should be a good closer. But if you look at the front screen on the right here, you see Louis Laporte, local fella, just trying to make it during the 20s and the Great Depression. And here you see Al Capone over here. We're going to be featuring both of these gentlemen tonight. And fundamentally, I think I am more excited about learning about Louis Laporte and the people who were living in the Northwoods than actually celebrating, all the Capone lore. Though I enjoy it a great deal. It's important. We've gotten some brand new collections that are so exciting. But from my point of view, I'm going to take time to point out the regular folks who are just living in the Northwoods, trying to make a living at what they do. So with that being said, let's get into the presentation. So some historic context here. We received a exciting collection from Mitch and Babe Hawkinsons and the Scott family to celebrate the Halliburton and Bill and Lorraine Sell. And we're sharing all of those because of the generosity of that family. So when we look at all of this, I'm admitting people right now. I apologize for the delay. Okay. I think I got everybody in the room. When you look at moonshining, it's important to look at the overall timeline. And I have, as an evidentiary historian, good documentation that we had moonshining going on here in 1895 and up to 1936. Now, this blows a hole in the notion that Prohibition was the only time this kind of behavior was going on. So what's going to happen is that we're going to find early examples and these post-prohibition violators. My earliest example is here from E.H. Huff from Forest and Stream magazine, written in 1895. He was coming from Manitowish. He said, on this day, as we were going along the railroad trail, which led out of Manitowish, we came upon a man lying on his back on the snow in the middle of the road. He was motionless, and when I went up to him, I thought he was dead, but at length saw he was only paralyzed by pine wood whiskey. That's right, they were making just the lowest grade of moonshine right in Manitowish in 1895, and there'll actually be more moonshining going on afterward. So we have a bigger frame, and that's really part of what I like to talk about in the development of the presentation. So early speakeasies and blind pigs, this is some of the language we're going to be using. A speakeasy is where you would get cocktails and wine. A blind pig is where you'd get shots of hard liquor and beer. All right. On Stone Lake, there was a blind pig in 1915, well before Prohibition. This is Stone Lake in Manitowish waters. This is on Betzer or Beaumont Island. And in each of these cases, we'll find that there was fisticuffs going on between George Devine and Louis Laporte, of course, over a girl. But there was a small backwoods bar built for the patronage of only men back in the day. Well, so when we think about all of what's going on prohibition and law enforcement, it's important to see these three groups, the federal, the state, and the local. And it should be understood that they did not work collectively well. Matter of fact, in some cases, they absolutely worked at cross purposes. So within the whole period of prohibition, we also had a bunch of individuals who would be considered drives, those who were for prohibition and the Volstead Act that enforced the 18th Amendment. One such person would be a guy from Chicago named Cap Smith, as you see below there. He was a big fella in the Republican Party, and he said that on his property, he found these two big Studebakers, the old 7-passenger kind they made, and had cases of whiskey solid in the back of them. And the FBI agents at Grandpa had brought them in where they could catch them in on their way to Hurley. So he facilitated an arrest. And so with all the moonshining that is going on in Manitowish waters and the surrounding communities, it's important to understand that there were people who were actively drives in enforcing this Volstead Act. To that same extent, between the wet versus dry moral debate, the social engineering going into into World War I, you can see in 1912 these dark states. These are the wet states, and if we look in close, it's hard to believe, but there were dry counties in northern Wisconsin. Many of this was done through the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, but these were placards supporting dry behavior, and they were really quite strong. It's interesting, in Eagle River in 1917, Phelps and Eagle River absolutely went dry during the period. And it's not clear how they thought they were going to enforce all of these laws, but they came down initially with a heavy hand. So by 1917, when they started to enforce these ordinances, the local guys running the gin mills just went across the border from Vilas County to Oneida County and opened up their ice cream parlors. And they were right across the borderline and enjoyed a lot of good business. So boundary lines matter in prohibition. State boundary lines matter a great deal. We'll be talking shortly about the difference between Michigan and Wisconsin, using Hurley as an example, but even between the counties, jurisdictions of sheriffs and alike. Crandon was a major hub of moonshine production, one of the biggest. Arguably, Crandon and Hurley were the two greatest at the time. And what you have here with Crandon, they were actually a dry town, which is unthinkable because their moonshine violations go way back. But in the town itself, it had a women's Christian temperance union movement. This comes out of a great document that you can get from the Wisconsin Historical Society, Northern Choices, Rural Forest County in the 1920s. I'll give you some links on that a little bit later. But even Leona, which was just a little bit east where William Connor ran his big plant, his mill, he actually kept it wet because he had to keep his men working, but he was also a dry. So if you take a look now, we're going to take a bit of a swing at Hurley. And Hurley, in my research, has become so large, and I've done research up there with some of the historians, that I'm only going to, in this presentation, account for those who are coming from Hurley to the Manitowish waters. And there's a lot, and there's some really great stories. But I think this is going to really cap off our discussion about creating context here. So early on, up at the top, reported by the Iron County Miner in 1920, the feds, the federal prohibition officers, infiltrated the Hurley bartender group, and he set up a run of liquor from Milwaukee with 5 cars all the way up to Hurley. So he's an embedded individual. And all these bar tenders, including John Chapucio, were driving up from Hurley. And so there was this signal that they had of honking the horn and flashing the lights, that when they came to the area where there would be a stage roadblock, the federal officers would come out of the woods. So that happened. It happened north of Mercer in the town of Oma, just before the turn of Pine Lake. And what occurred was the federal officers came out, gave a little warning. They drove a little bit past them, and they just opened fire immediately. It was argued then by the coroners of Hurley that they didn't give them enough time to stop, and the bullet that killed Capuzio went through the roof of the car, and then it fragmented and went into the back of his head and neck, and it was a fatal injury. But here's the deal. Hurley and Iron County is going to press murder charges against the federal agent. So this is pretty much unprecedented, where law enforcement officers and the local municipalities go back and forth. Well, Philin was the guy who was the trigger man in all of this, and he stayed up in Michigan. But it illustrates well how hard they were going to push on Hurley, and how hard Hurley and Iron County was going to push back. In speaking with folks up in the Hurley area, I was told that if you ever were elected sheriff, you never had to work another day in your life, because there were internal workings within the community and the government to make sure everybody took care of everyone else on Silver Street and beyond. But they didn't stop there. They came back up on January 1st and did an absolute dragnet raid in Hurley. They captured 57 saloon keepers and barkeepers. They sent up 50 agents doing a dragnet, going on either side of the block and hauling these men in the streets. They brought up with them not one, but 2 specialized Pullman trains just for law enforcement. It seems like a scene from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And over time, what we see from Northern Michigan Professor Bajinga, he says that the head of the Michigan State Police said if it weren't for Hurley, which he couldn't touch, the UP wouldn't be a problem. So this hard, heavy hand of enforcement is going to be lifted. And the difference between Michigan enforcement and Wisconsin enforcement is significant. Here we go, more context. World War I, before the war, propaganda supported prohibition. For the guys fighting in the war, victory is stamina, send wheat and fats and fuel. The barkeeper is a non-essential. The saloon backer is a traitor. If you look here, the Victorian era fades and the 20s comes in with the flapper image. Here we have in Manitowish waters, two sets of women just maybe a decade apart. Here this woman has a corset on, probably a whalebone corset, and her tiny waist, long hat, and to her wrist, to her ankle, to the nape of her neck. And these are flappers with striking V-cut necklines, bobbed hair, and alike. This is a shot on Alder Lake, by the way. And so we're going to move from Victorian moral standards to the more lax new woman of the 1920s. There's also a heavy influence from the Kintucks. The Kintucks who came into Forest County will be running, and I will show this slide, 3 times, are believed to have become establishing the manufacturing of moonshine in 3 surrounding counties. They are frankly a syndicate in the area, and we'll be developing this as time goes on. Deliveries for this kind of liquor, sure, it could go to the bar in Little Bohemia, and from the same still, a batch could go all the way down to Cicero, Illinois, where Capone is, or to the Twin Cities, where the mobs were operating there as well. Also driving locals like Louis Laporte and those living here in the Northwoods into the practice of moonshining is after the peak of demand for agri-products. There's an agri-recession right after World War I, and that recession will continue until we get the Great Depression, and then there's a collapse between all agri-economies. So these were hard times in the Northwoods, and moonshining was essential for people to feed their families, to be quite honest. Here's a kind of fun little editorial from the Rhinelander Daily News. As we look here, this was just showing the difficulty federal agents had all over the country trying to enforce the Volstead Act and stop the movement of liquor. So we're going to take a look at the last analytical phase of our work here, but it's really one of the most important. So you see all these dots here. We're going to visit all of these towns and talk about moonshining in those areas. When you talk about moonshine, is a whole system from start to finish with supplies, tons of sugar and grain and pounds of yeast had to be developed. You had to manufacture, that's the still. Then you had to store it or wholesale it. Then you had to move it, which was dangerous in distribution. And then you had retail. And finally, you had to launder the money. We're going to see all of those phases in this presentation. I also want to talk a little bit about how I got into this just less than 2 years ago, basically a year and a half. Well, we were working in the Manitowish Waters Historical Society with partners on creating an interpretive trail, which we made at Camp Mercer, right off of Highway 51 near River's Edge. And it's a lovely trail, but like a lot of historical sites, here's the CCC camp, we found other cultural sites, like 2 logging camps here and here. But then we found these 2 structures, these 2 dugout holes that didn't make any sense. We used LIDAR, which is a laser driven scanning that's pulled by a drone or an airplane to show the depth of land. And we found these pits here and then down here. And then we ultimately went to explore them and noticed they're both by the river here. And we found that they were not identical. One was bigger than the other. Here's the biggest one, and it's right by the Manitowish River with a little bit of meadow sedge, and it's about 20 feet by 40 feet. And I don't think you can see that video that's playing on mine, so I'm just going to go ahead. Here's the one that is on the other side. You can see the river up here, but you can see that there's actually an egress down into it. It's a perfect square, and it's right by the river again. And we're hypothesizing that these may be moonshine caches, that whole retail and wholesale elements of what we do. Well, close to that, those areas is this man's home, Louis Laporte. Louis Laporte is here at a Grant Lake still. Here's the Moonshining, and that is a young Emil Winnetka. So if you think the folks in Little Bohemia were involved in moonshining, you have your answer right now. And what we'll find is they'll be arrested first in 22, Manitowish Waters hooch hound caught with the goods en route to Woodruff, and again in 1924. Now, this whole story becomes romantic. And so Louis running this still, and so that's the manufacturing size, but he has to have somebody run it down south. And don't forget Emil Winnetka here. So Emil was one of the customers from Manitowish, and Nancy Laporte right here, soon to be Nancy Winnetka. Here she is brandishing a pistol to land a sturgeon or a muskie. And you can see the kind of swagger there. Women were involved in moonshining, actively going out, part of the delivery process and alike. And of course, this couple will host John Dillinger in April of 1934. So it all begins here and it grows from this spot. So here's Louis Laporte's home. Here's the big cache. Here's the small cache. And here's their still. And of course, from Grant Lake, they would just go right at the river and store their hooch. Later in 24, Louis Laporte will be busted again. He'll be caught for possession on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. There was a jug coming out of the back of his sack. People called the Chicago Northwestern the Whiskey Northern because so much liquor was moving on the train itself. And ultimately, Louis got enough trouble to be indicted by a grand jury by 1924. You have to be doing a lot of work to have that kind of an indictment. So here's another story of a person from Manitowish and Manitowish Waters, Cliff Powell. His sister Ethel was operating a resort on Dam Lake. He was selling moonshine in Lac de Flambeau. As kind of a joke, folks in these parts had a statement when you were going off to the Milwaukee House of Corrections. People would ask where Cliff was, and they'd say he's off to college. That's what they called it here back in the day. But he was probably supporting his sister Ethel right here at Fern Lodge on the outlet of the Manitowish River from Dam or Vance Lake. As we move a little bit further within this in the Iron County Minor, we see more intoxicated liquor is going to be coming out of the area of Manitowish by Frank Alvey, and he's going to be arrested for violating the prohibition laws there. Even at what today is River's Edge, the Wayside, or later known as Circle Lily. Here you see classic pictures of Circle Lily with a slot machine here during those days. Louis Lafine was caught selling illegal liquor there as well. So River's Edge was another one of those illegal blind pigs that were operating in the time. But at the same time, liquor was moving from Lac de Flambeau here. Mary King, a Chippewa Indian, as it cites here, here she is working with Sarah Vance. They did all sorts of crafts together, were good friends, but this poverty hit the Indian reservations in Lac de Flambeau, as well as it hit the regular folks in the Northwoods, and liquor was going back and forth. And she'll be cited several times. And it's funny that the moccasins and trade goods that these two women made were bought up by tourists and locals all the time. So this, the whole notion that, a lot of people engaged, both tribal and non-tribal people, because they're trying to make ends meet. Well, now we go to the big fella. Here he is, Scarface himself. We gained this collection in November of 22, and it's interesting, by about January to February of 23, Milwaukee Public Television reached out to me and said, We want to come up and interview you. We want to know about this new Capone collection from up in Winchester. And they said, the reason why we want to, everybody has a story about Al Capone being in the Northwoods, but no one has physical evidence. And we have a lot, and I'm going to go over it. This is a slide of pictures of Capone with his manager, Frank Pope, staging for pictures, standing in front of Bill Sell, pioneer, ranger, entrepreneur, logger, extraordinary real estate leader in the area. He and Al Capone became best friends. And they love fishing and baseball and eating and alike. And what occurs is this has to go through some other changes over time, because Capone started to come up probably right away in 1920. In 1924, Capone wrote his second to last letter to Bill Sell up in Winchester, and this letter is absolutely amazing. It says, "Well, Bill, I want you to find the bootlegger that sold me the wine and whiskey when I was there, and tell him that I want him to come right away to Cicero, because I have a big order for him. Tell him to come over to 2242 Cicero. That is just a few miles outside of Chicago. When he gets there, ask for Fred Pope." And this was signed Al Brown, which was the alias for Al Capone. That was his business name. This is his business address. Keep an eye on the wine element of this, if you would. It's really quite important. Here you see the signature line for Al Capone at home, for Al Capone, and for Al Brown. This is all part of that collection as well that exists in the Capone collection that was given by the Hawkinsons and Scotts. Here is the second letter that was sent out from Capone to Bill Sell. 2 days after Capone had an assassination attempt, Capone writes Bill, he says, "Friend Sell, no doubt you'll be surprised to hear from me. Well, pal, things have been so darn exciting that I haven't even had time or a chance to do this. Well, Sells, old boy, how are you doing, and how is the missus? And your dear little slugger, are you going to make a champion out of him? If you are, I'll be his manager. And tell him that I've got a big rocking horse. So write me and let me know how the best way to ship it. Well, pal, have no more to say. Only give my best wishes to your dear wife and all of your brothers. Try to make a trip later. Your pal and friend Al Capone. P.S. Let me know if I can do anything for you." The relationship here is really an interesting one, and really kind of impressive as you take a look at what's going on here. And he was often working with Fred Pope, this gentleman right here. Now, Pope came up and worked with other groups and Teamster unions. But I mean, why did these guys come up? It's right here. Fred Pope's holding two, looks to be close to 10-pound walleyes on a stringer, and they came up and golfed, and they had a good time. This was a vacation spot where they felt safe, and they trusted people. So it's an interesting thing as we take a look here at in the 1920s. Capone, in 1920, Capone moved from New York to Chicago. And what occurs is that New York, this is a map that shows Italian heritage, it's all dark. And he moves here to Chicago, and in Chicago, this is looking good. There's some Italians here. But if you're an Italian like Al Capone and you need to find another Italian community, where are you going to go? Well, you don't have to look too far. Right up here, these are the Italian mining communities, and Wisconsin has lax laws compared to Michigan and Illinois. And Al Capone is safe in the Northwoods with law enforcement like they have up in Iron County. So this somewhat explains why he is so comfortable coming to the area, and also why some of the wine production there would lend him to go up there and drink some of the wine that was being made in Hurley as well. Capone actually writes Bill Sell from prison in 1929 in Pennsylvania before he ended up in Alcatraz in the end. He had a small weapons charge where he went for several months to jail in eastern Pennsylvania. And he was asking specifically of buying the Trossel estate up by Winchester. Bill Sell immediately replies and says he hasn't seen Capone for 5 years at that point, but the Trossel estate couldn't be bought, but there were other estates, and it was clear that Al Capone was looking to come back to this area. In Mercer, where Al Capone's brother Ralph Capone not only came back, he lived and had a prosperous later life career and activities there. We see this picture is in the library of the Capones. I'm not sure if this is photographed in Mercer, but they have it there. But the Capone family was very much tied to this neck of the Northwoods. In Phelps itself, Capone's attorney was up in that area. And he had bought a large property, sold it, and then repurchased that property, a different property with a group of people in 1930. I'm going over this to show you how, again, Capone influence moves north near the UP border, but not quite over it. And also to show you how stories about Capone sometimes change over time. So this has been brought back up and it's used at many times. And they talk about Capone locally being there quite a bit. But in all honesty, Capone was in Pennsylvania prison from 29 August to March of 30, and he was in Atlanta and ultimately in Alcatraz starting in May of 32. And he was probably busy with some other things like the courtroom. So stories that are backed up by articles and so on, we need to vet all of those. Do I think Capone was ever in that area? I think, yeah, he visited this area from time to time, but his frequency there is probably far less probable. So as we did more and more of these presentations, what I ultimately came up with is people reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, Jim, you can't believe all the stuff we have." One fellow called me from Park Falls and said, "Hey, do you know about the big still that was underground with trap doors and secret tunnels to cabins?" I said, "No." So I called my friend in Springstead, and at that point, her name's Cookie. And I said, "Cookie, do you know anything about this wild tale of moonshining?" And she goes, "That would have been my grandfather," she said. And then she has given us an entire video, and that video will be connected in the description below the YouTube channel if any of you ever want to link up and see that as well. So here's the story with this. It's a clever person from Chicago again. But in this case, Cookie's grandfather was a pharmacist assistant. You may not know this, but during the period of Prohibition, it was possible to get a doctor's prescription to get liquor. And that was a lucrative business, but you still had to pay for the liquor. You still had to pay the tax. And as a physician assistant, Cookie's grandfather came up with an idea of making maple syrup in the Springstead area. Sounds really plausible, right? So you have one label of maple syrup for real maple syrup from Springstead, and the other one for your liquor. You think, wow, now that's clever. That's going to be, really incognito and disguised. It gets way better. So what they did is the trapdoors and cabins, these are pictures of them right here and on the general store. And what occurs is that Cookie's grandmother was the postmistress. Cookie's mom was the assistant postmistress. So they made the maple syrup and the hooch right there, and they shipped it back in the mail. And they used the United States Postal Service to move their product. Kind of an ingenious way to go about things. Here back in Manitowish waters, one of the most prolific moonshiners was Robert Lovelace and his Virgin Forest Park. He'll ultimately build 3 different bars. He says back in the day, moonshining is what Lovelace's tavern was all about. He created a tavern that could hold 300 to 400 people and a player piano. It was cantilevered over Alder Lake. Folks would come down and dance on the dance floor all night. They had midnight luncheons. They brought up jazz bands, black and white bands, jitney dancing, which is you have to pay to get a dance with a gal. And it was really quite an amazing experience. Sadly, this structure fell over snow load some years later, but for a long time, particularly from Hurley and Ironwood and from Michigan, folks would come down here to have a big time and to get away. But that isn't all what's going on in the Lovelace universe. So here we have Robert Lovelace, and here's a famous moonshine runner named Ole Fisher. Here's Lovelace's daughter sitting on Ole's rum running car, which is real exciting. Keep that in mind. Come over here. This is Sheriff Westfall from Milwaukee County. He's up here with his secretary, and I guess they were working on some special project together. This is Ole Fisher here, and this is Ole with Sheriff Westfall's wife. So a lot's going on in at the Lovelace's properties and the Virgin Forest. And when you look at this, the big pavilion was right here. This is where his sawmill was. And he had quite a rolling property. Also, from right here, there was a canal that went to an estate run by a gentleman by the name of Southgate. And Southgate had a huge estate that was built out here just as the railroads were coming. That ultimately will burn down and will go bust. But there was a still that was always suggested by local guides that was right here. Well, Lovelace working this area, and this is right over the reservation in Manitowish Waters and Little Trout Lake. There's a good possibility for where that still would be. And Robert Lovelace was arrested for running a blind pig all the way in 1934. So that's after Prohibition. So he was, again, persistent, and he built 3 bars. He built the big pavilion on Alder Lake. He built this bar, which would be on Twin Pine Road, right by before the dog leg by what was the Twin Pine. And then ultimately out to Highway 51. And this is Howling Dog Tavern that's still here today. So with the shootouts and trouble, you have to understand these problems are going to persist everywhere. We'll go over 4 accounts of these kind of thugs trying to roll businesses that are selling illegal liquor, gambling, or dealing in prostitution, or all 3. The first shootout here we have is at the Tower Tea Room in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin. Oscar Hankey was the man who was running the Tower Tea Room. And in running the tea room itself, he quit at about 11 o'clock, came out, and there were several bandits out there. And they said, stick them up, and then just opened fire. It didn't make a lot of sense. They weren't there to rob him. It was basically a hit. It's a small caliber weapon. He was shot in the chest, the arm, and in the hand. And then rather than seeking medical help, he walked 3.5 miles to Plunkett Farm, and a guy, remember this name, Goudreau, came down and drove him out to Grandview Hospital, where he received his medical attention. So there's kind of this triad that goes on, as where you have moonshine, you also have prostitution quite often, and you certainly have gambling. And there's some evidence of that small green building to the right of what is Anglers today may have held prostitutes on occasion. So Judge Kirsten from Chicago ultimately was removed from the bench in 1925 for insanity, but he had a place right here on Rest Lake. There's Fox Island. Here's the dam. Here's Judge Kirsten's property right here. Kind of curious to have him here with all these other individuals parading around. Well, this property is now owned by the Clacks, and they have shared with me that they found, when they had to clear some houses out there, this hydrometer. And basically, there's a bulb right here, and it says percent of proof spirits at 60 degrees. So that is a curiosity for sure. And right in that same area, just up the river, we had one of the most famous kidnappings during this gangland period. It is Leon Gleckman. He was the Al Capone of St. Paul. He ran the Jewish gangs there, and it was all about liquor. Here's a quote from Gleckman going to federal prison in 24. It says that the brains of the Twin City alcohol rings was Leon Gleckman. So what happens? Gleckman gets kidnapped. He gets hauled up to Hurley. Again, these connections to Manitowish waters. And he was held basically on, they say Rest Lake, but it is on the channel between Rest and Stone Lake. And many believe that he was held there by Chicago interests trying to intimidate the St. Paul gang to try not to muscle into the region. So again, here you see Manitowish waters as being a hub. You know, people often talk about Dillinger, but I've barely mentioned him. He comes at the end of the story. There was a road, a well-worn road up here for people who were following Dillinger's lifestyle. Kerner's was the large resort that's right across from Greer's Pier by the Highway 51 bridge. This is the Spider Lake side. They had a floating blind pig back in the day, which was very creative, because what you could do then is that you could go out and get all the drinks you want on the water. And if any law enforcement comes, all you have to do is drop your bottles over deep water, and they will go to the very bottom of the lake, and you're not going to be arrested. This is one of my most exciting updated stories. We got this just from a video that Kate Kranz had done. This is about a Hurley family with ties to Manitowish waters. So Amadeo and Teresa came from different parts of Italy, and they met in Hurley. Their last name is Morchetti, and Morchetti's business, Amadeo, was running Paul's Tavern, and he imported the grapes, the trainloads of grapes that would be sold to other families. They had 23 cars of grapes in this citation coming to Caspian by Iron River. They would move those grapes, and homemade wine was being brewed in all these Italian mining areas. I was told just last week that the Mondovi brand out in California actually came from Virginia, Minnesota, and they were hauling in grapes and then took their trades of winemaking out to California. So they had their family, they had 3 kids, and then what occurs is Morchetti owned Paul's Bar, but he passed away. And then Teresa's left to raise 3 children. So what occurs is here on Silver Street, Teresa was having to make her living running Paul's Bar. But she also then put a false wall in her apartment, and then in that apartment, she would make the homemade wine. The homemade wine would then be carried in baby carriages by her 4-year-old daughter down Silver Street, across the bridge to a blind pig on the other side. Teresa will do this for a while, but will be turned in and the feds will get her. And actually, one of their neighboring friends took the fall and went to jail for 18 months. So Teresa did not have to. And his name was Calderon. And he ultimately came back and lived on Spider Lake and managed the properties there that his entire life. So on Big Lake, there was also a love triangle. These were moonshiners. These were also Kintucks, and they were doing the work of moonshining. And then Donahoe actually killed one of the other the husband, and it became a lovers triangle. And there was a terrible shootout there. The wife ultimately escaped. Kay Crons has a wonderful YouTube video on this. We will enter that into the descriptions a little bit later. From Presque Isle to Eagle River to St. Germain, there's a lot that is going on in this area, and this will be one of our first geographic runs. So up in Presque Isle, we'll see that a moonshiner constable will be slain here on Mermaid Lake. And what we have is backcountry Kentuck moonshiners had moved into the area. This guy is the name of Charles Boring. And over here, there was also a William Stanley who was wanted for murder. Here at the company town of Vilas logging company, lumber company, we will see that George Rutherford was the Methodist minister, constable, locomotive engineer, and the leader of the KKK. He went with his wife out to try and to arrest Boring. When he does, he sneaks up on Boring, tries to draw on him, and Boring raises a gun. They have a gunfight. Boring gets shot in the hand, and Rutherford gets shot right above the eye, and he dies. This then becomes a rolling posse, and then a series of fights and embattlements. And the Kintucks were actually all captured, and they faced lynch mobs at the time, and the Oneida County Sheriff actually had to come up. Interesting, during this period, Charlie Spencer shared that his father was indirectly involved with this, knew Boring and others, and he was up there just doing the work that he did. He had his still. He would hide his stills in bog swamps such as this, set up the still, start a batch, put his beaver traps out, come back, switch his hooch out, go back, get his beavers, and start processing them, do another batch. And this is how people made a living, and ultimately went to Little Bohemia to sell his moonshine to Emil Winnetka. Back to Boring being down in Eagle River, they had to triple their guards in the jail to make sure the Kintucks, Boring and Stanley and others were not lynched in the period. Tug Spencer, we'll see, he will be arrested. This is the Spencer who was at the shootout site learning how to make moonshine at the time. There was a squad of federal men that was also sent up to bust a lot of things early in 1921. The stings continued to move through Eagle River quite quickly. They were known as being some of the worst hooch makers anywhere within the region. And we'll see in 1921, one person, this A.H. Reed, the Judge Reed had to inform Hahn that you can't just make moonshine for your own consumption. This was the thought there. And Eagle River was absolutely seen as a lawless area. The dry agents made a huge sting here. They brought in Special Agent Walter Sunderland. But it's interesting, his wife, Olive Sunderland, was the one who really spent 3 weeks undercover. And when they made the arrest, all 10 who were captured, the rum runners there, couldn't believe that Olive Sunderland is part of that sting. They didn't even offer resistance. And basically, they knocked down one of the worst prohibition violators anywhere in Wisconsin. Moving over to St. Germain, we'll see that they had a huge alcohol plant there, and they basically had a dual processing system when the prohibition agents came in. So down here, they would do a lot of their manufacturing near Highway 51 and 8, and then they would haul the material up here to St. Germain. They rented a cottage at a resort and actually poked a hole in the roof and had to send the tower for distilling the hooch all 10 feet above the roof. And so they did a lot of damage there, but they could produce 1,000 to 2,000 gallons of alcohol in 24 hours, as reported from this operation. So now we're going to follow the Moonshine Trail all the way down to Rhinelander real quick, just bouncing through different places. Here we are in Wausau, or Woodruff rather, and there's prohibition officers there arrested folks, and you can see the Woodruff, which is the rougher side of the Minocqua Woodruff area. But Minocqua had its large stills as well, and prohibition agents came up and destroyed gigantic stills in that area. Lake Tomahawk had a mash plant. Please keep an eye on these numbers. 4,700 gallons of mash on hand. And then as we keep moving down Highway 47 in Newborn, they found a new still 1 mile away from a site of a still they had just busted a short time ago. And so these kind of violations are kind of on a rolling are rolling up in the newspaper, but really most folks are getting arrested and then turning around and going right back to the business of making moonshine. Rhinelander was a very strange town, and we're going to look at it quite a bit. And what we're going to notice is in 1920s, moonshine was being cracked down by the dry. Sam Pernier, he's going to be the mayor of the town, and it was said that moonshine was bringing 50 cents a drink here. And again, the Whiskey Northern comes up again, but these moonshine guys were using the lockers in the Rhinelander station, but it was all Forest County, and these are the Kentucks and Crandon, and they make the best moonshine and really do the best distilling within the period. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is the Dry Agents Find a Mammoth Still in Rhinelander. This is part of the Kentuck group again, but it was located in a swamp surrounded by tall timber, 1 mile from any trail and 3 miles from any highway. And again, they are being tipped off. So these law enforcement agents are really struggling because you're going to find out that the Kentucks, again, have this syndicate where they're running 3 or more counties through their influence. But I don't want you to think all the moonshine is really good like the Kentucks. Here we have an example in McNaughton where there was poor moon. Some of the worst, dirtiest, rottenest I've ever saw, said the sheriff. And that is in 1828. So as we get into Rhinelander, where we have a lot of activity going on, do you see a pattern here within the sheriffs? Every other term we get this guy, and yes, Hans Rod is the wet within all of Oneida County sheriffs. Brooker's deputies chuckle his 291 gallon spill, and they mock the liquor interest there. He's one of the dries, but I'll tell you what, Rhinelander was wet, wet, wet. And the guy who made it most wet is Joe Seraphin right here, Pine Lake. He was given 30 days here in jail and had to post bond as well of $2,000, which would be almost $35,000 today. But here you see Joe Seraphin. Why do I want to talk about that a lot? Because after doing a presentation at Rhinelander, I met his daughter, Kathy Steffens, and she has done a remarkable YouTube video, which will be linked into the descriptions here, that literally runs the arc of his life. from being a young man with nothing and facing severe challenges, making his first bar with 2 barrels and a board outside of a mill, and he poured whiskey, to being the kingpin of crime within in Rhinelander. So here you see Joe Serafin, and he really personifies the whole idea of he's going to run liquor, he's going to run gambling, and he's going to run girls. And he also called it good business what he did. So when the lumberjacks would come up, they would always go to his place, because when they would get drunk and fall asleep or get in a fight, he would take their wallets and hold it for them until they left. He called it good business. He said he would take money from any sucker, but not these guys. They work too hard. So all the lumberjacks would go back to his place. Kathy was born, she's 80, in her 80s right now, from Joe, certainly, obviously, but Joe started his family very, very late in life and was reformed. But the women, the girls, the prostitutes who were working in that area, still hung around for a while before he turned over a new leaf, and she called them their aunts. I love this one out of Rhinelander. People rent land sometimes to help their agriculture. This renter during the Great Depression took all the grain, made moonshine with it, let the pigs go hungry, and sold the illegal shine. In this case, they were locking up bars in Rhinelander, and that was important because by padlocking the bars, they would stop the illegal traffic and try to stop these moonshine exchanges. The fact of the matter is, a lot of these articles like this are just propaganda. They were just doing that for show, so the feds and the state wouldn't come in. When you think of farm, forest, and moonshine, now that we start to go into Crandon and Monaco and Harrison Hills, this is going to be the perfect template. Hide in the woods, get your grain here, have water sources. This is key. Rhinelander Daily News, this is the giant towers they were creating for evaporation. This was the Joe Serafin still. He had a 10-horse boiler, 2 150-gallon cookers, 300 galvanized tanks, and 300 feet of assorted pipe, and they ran water right out of the Wisconsin River so they could make huge numbers of this. He had a column 19 feet high that would come out of the top of a house. As we move to Monaco, we see the Kintucks are there, and they found a still in a dense swamp 1.5 miles north of Monaco. But we're closing in now on Crandon, certainly. And Crandon is they're the varsity players in moonshining. More than 2,500 gallons of confiscated moonshine at one time. They are an absolute hub. And this is covered in Northern Choices in rural Forest County in the 1920s. Faulkner, a Kentuckian from Crandon, this is 1907, very early, was the alleged king of illicit liquor in 1907. This is well before Prohibition. He had 25 counts on him at that time. The traditions that were already there were phenomenal, there being the greater Crandon area. Written in the Northern Choices article, it was very clear. The author cites, these illicit stills are not crude cobbled together apparatus of hillbilly jokes and legends. There's some enormous commercial operations, mammoth outfits. But my favorite one, this is hard to believe, this is just north of Crandon in Alvin, and it's right by Michigan where they're trying to ship their liquor over. In a swamp in Alvin, federal agents found a still capable of turning out 350 gallons of 133 proof alcohol every 8 hours. So when you think about where does the liquor come from the city, well, a lot of it is coming from up here. We also see that we have these toughs, like the guy who shot Oscar Hankey in Manitowish waters at the Wolf River Tavern. There was an attack and Lehman shot the intruder in the leg. Archie Thielen was a tavern keeper at Merrill. He was actually in Harrison Hills, and we'll find out about him getting raided, attacked too by other criminal interests very shortly afterwards. Here we are at his soft drink parlor. Minnesota thugs come in to roll him as well. So these toughs, these younger men who want to make money, they see these bars as areas of easy money, and there's gunplay and robbery that take place in all of them. So when you look at Harrison, Harrison is just east of Tomahawk. There's a lot going on there. They confiscated 25,000 gallons of mash in one bus. Now, this is in 1992, and the Harrison folks have done a lot of great work of capturing their moonshine history. I would say better than anyone, because as a Dutch enclave, they had a great tradition. This is a quote from some of the history out of Harrison Hills, and it is perhaps my favorite. Here's Tomahawk right here. Here's Harrison Hills. That's the direct route, but they would go to Rhinelander with the train. No one was making alcohol like us. We use Coke, which is smokeless, the most expensive. They came in train loads up to Rhinelander, and the boys would go and get it. They didn't have to ask no questions of nobody. They had all the papers fine and dandy. Coke is the coal that they use to make steel. It is smokeless, it's expensive, it is flat out industrial. And they're moving this illegally and working with the folks that I described in length in Rhinelander to get access to go to this area in Harrison Hills. This is one of the most famous busts in 1932. Early, more modern articles in 1989 say cows get drunk after raid on Harrison stills. So in Harrison, basically, agents found 800 gallons of alcohol, 10,000 gallons of mash, and they has a capacity for 40,000 gallons of mash, and they took it all and they poured it in a creek. And it all went downstream, and it probably was hard on the fish, and evidently the cows had quite a buzz after all of that. This one is absolutely off the hook and interesting. Just down the road from Harrison Hills is Parrish, Wisconsin. You may not know this, but there was a Wisconsin oil company. Here it is, the derrick and so on. It's a facade. This is their cooling tower, the pipe that goes up the derrick so they can make their moonshine. And it says there are moonshiners all around Harrison. Groups said they were running an oil company, but they were cooking moon left and right, you know. They would go pound on this just a little bit, but it is just really how creative these local people were in their manufacturing and operation. And the skids were greased with, you know, rolls of cash that came from Chicago. Now, as we get into the post-prohibition area, we see that bootleggers and stills are going on. Blind pigs, why not? Let's go to Silver Street in 1934, and it says Joseph Choate, director of the Federal Alcohol Control, said 2/3 of all liquor being sold in America is still illegal after prohibition is over. So it continues to go. And the Rhinelander Daily News in Weingart or Presque Isle, there was violations. In Crandon, still violations, large plants. Even an alderman in Rhinelander was arrested for having, you know, illegal liquor. And in 1936, Harrison Hills was the site of the largest boiler ever seized by state agents ever. Here is an old newspaper that shows that seizure. So they started way before Prohibition making illegal hooch, and they made it quite a bit after as well. But now we're going to go and take a little bit of a trip to a unique Mercer connection and other things. Now, Mercer itself had its own challenges. And bear with me here. Early on in 1921, they talk about the tragedy of a young man who drank too much and fell off the train and drowned there. But as time goes on, there were more and more arrests there. Ed LeClaire and William Gormley were both making moonshine in both of their places. You know, one is a mile north of Mercer, remember that. And they're running they're running whorehouses as well in these areas, and they're participating in a lot of gambling all at once. Mitch Babbitt is one of the great pioneers of that time, and this is a grisly story. Almost a mile northeast of town, there was a house of prostitution. A madam by the name of Miller ran the house. Mr. Babbitt's uncle told me that the lady would get the lumberjacks drunk, take their money, shoot them on the tracks, and wait for the train to run them over. Seems like Joe Serafin's would be a better place to stay, where he gives you your money back when you're done. Babbitt also spoke of that every saloon had a jug of moonshine under it. Mr. Babbitt remembers his grandmother sending him to Moonshine Jimmy's in Mercer and a jar of horseradish to trade for a pint of moonshine. And she always paid Mr. Babbitt off with one of those big yellow sugar cookies for basically doing the rum running. So gambling was often going on. Here you see Billy's Bar, Goodrow's Bar. That is the gas station today in downtown Mercer. So prostitution, gambling, moonshine, it all goes together. And now we have a curious crime connection that's going to go all the way from Mercer all the way to Rhinelander. That is really quite a strange extortion plan. So here we have Billy's Rathskeller. Now you need to know Ralph Capone was the unofficial manager of Billy's Bar. And Ralph Capone always says, I'm just a regular guy. I need money. And, I've turned over a new leaf after going to prison and alike. But it was known that Ralph Capone was very much connected for quite some time. Here's Billy's Bar in an old picture right there. So the Capone had a network that was linked in the Northwoods. So Capone, this is Ralph Capone now, not Al Capone, had this money, but he had to launder it. So he went down to Rhinelander to the Building and Loan, which is like in A Wonderful Life with George Bailey, not run with regulators, but members of the community, citizens and friends that didn't have the same kind of regulations. This later becomes Rhinelander Savings and Loan, and Heart of the Lake Savings Society. It was right across from DeBiles. And when he would go in there, he would say, I need to take a loan. And he would take out a big loan. And then he would pay off the loan before the term was due, always in cash. He has laundered his money. He's gotten good money in the loan, paid it off with dirty money, and I can guarantee you he was doing that not only in Rhinelander, but in other communities that had building and loans as well. Well, let's get to this extortion plot. Of all the thugs who try to knock off people, the most notorious, without a doubt, is the one against Billy Goodrow in Billy's Bar. Remember, Goodrow picked up Oscar Hankey after he was shot in front of the Tower Tea Room. So here's the note. Leave the Oneida Hotel at 3 p.m. Tuesday, turn the corner, take Highway 63 to Gross Schoolhouse, proceed a half mile, drop the money by the flagpole, and go to Merrill. All righty. So that is what happened. I need to read to you now the original extortion letter. This was printed in the newspaper. Okay. This is the first of these letters. Dear Mr. Goodrow, please pardon this long letter, but it is really necessary. We are not what you would call bloodthirsty lot, but we mean what we say. After investigating all the well-to-do people in this territory, we find that you are our best prospect. We are going to ask you a favor. If you value your life and property, please pay strictest attention to the rest of this letter. 1, we want $5,000 of money. 2, we want this money in 10s and 20 bills, not marked. 3, we want you to stay away from the law. We mean that. 4, if you go to the law, we will take your life. 5, if they put you in a cell to protect you, or if you leave this territory, we will have to ruin your property and then wait our chance at you. We're equipped to do this. 6, it's either a matter of paying $5,000 or losing your life and property. 7, we only work on a victim once. If he doesn't pay, he's dead or ruined. If he pays, we don't bother him again. 8, if you care to receive further instructions from this, please place an ad in the Iowa Daily Globe, classified section, baby carriage cheap, please telephone 1666W. Your deadline for this ad is next Wednesday. 10, if the ad appears, that signifies you wait further instructions. If the ad does not appear, that means that you have signed your death warrant. Please do not go to the law. Police protection will not help you. That's all we have to say now. Wishing you a lot of luck. Friendly enemies. What could be more dangerous? All right. That qualifies for an extortion letter, to be sure. So what actually happens? Well, in a strange way, our good friends in Iron County start to work with other law enforcement areas. And so a joint Iron Oneida County task force shows up at Gross School. And they bushwhack these two guys. So the first guy they killed is Rogers. He was, his name is Robert Rojas Long Bob Rogers. As he got out of the car, they just shot him because he would not try to surrender at that point. He bore several other bullet wounds and log stab wounds and was a real problem. The extortion himself, this is the guy running, his name was Stochi. He actually had a hideout at Stone Lake in Manitowish waters. He stayed there with a Hurley woman. He was called a yegg, which is an itinerant safe cracker or bank robber or burglar. But what happens to Stochi, he comes out, an Iron County sheriff has him dead to rights with a Tommy gun, a machine gun, pulls a trigger and it jams. Stochi rolls under the car, goes to the back side of the car, and then is apprehended at Gross School and ultimately will go on trial. So Rogers is dead. Stochi, the yegg who hid out on Stone Lake, is apprehended. What we see here, Stochi gets arrested at this point. He gets 10 years in prison. And then he ultimately enters a plea deal in 1935. And in doing that, he kind of missed the whole plea deal early, but he turned in Joe Seraphin and Rhinelander and gives up that big still to get years knocked off of his prison sentence. This is getting close to the end of the presentation, but I've got two sites that I can't reveal the exact location, but we found from doing these presentations. This is a house that is in the Northwoods. The cabin sits in the blue. The cellar is underneath with 4 feet to the side, and they built these huge double cedar horizontal logs here. So they're doubled there, and they put potatoes up here. This guy was a Polish immigrant, and he ran a still in this basement. And he sold his vodka to Little Bohemia, and and he sold them in mason jars still in the basement and in these milk pails. I would contend that we have more places like that in the Northwoods, and people who share that allow us to have greater insights, and we can do so with anonymity. Another person told me and sent me this picture. They just bought a property from their grandparents. They went into the garage, pulled back some things. There was a trap door. They opened up the trap door. There was a still in the bottom of it. Who knew? And there are many, many more of these. I found one of these yesterday talking to a business person in the area. So keep sharing these stories and pictures because it helps us in preserving this important history. There's a real movement now that we may try to create a geolocated moonshine trail going all the way from Harrison Hills all the way up here into the area around Hurley. There'll be more on that in the future, but they need to be authentic, and it needs to be more than the stories. But like, Little Bohemia qualifies, we have that that great evidence. So here's my last slide as we're running out of time. And this is in the Iron County Minor, but it comes from around Sheboygan. And I'll just read this. And it says, why dry agents weep, wail, and gnash their teeth. An attorney, prohibition agents returned to Milwaukee Monday after raiding an expedition in other parts of the state told the story. An attorney arose in court at Sheboygan to defend a saloon keeper whose place had been raided twice within an hour, and a quart of moonshine seized each time. Gentlemen of the jury, he said, Joseph Susha is not on trial here today, but the Volstead Act. If you believe in the Volstead Act, find him guilty. If you do not, find him not guilty and take another slam at prohibition. That was all of his defense, all his argument. The jury went out and returned shortly with a verdict of not guilty. All righty. So I guess we move into questions at this point.
Yeah, Jim, I just took it back from you. So if we can, people have questions. We have a couple written ones. I've answered a couple already, but if you want further answers, so Jim, so given the widespread moonshining going on in the Northwoods, if vacationers from the South travel to the Northwoods just to drink alcohol, you think that happened?
All right. I think if you look at it from the business side, if your business didn't have alcohol, you are going to have a lot of trouble getting tourists to come to you. Was it the only reason why people came up here? No. But once they were up here for all the recreation, I think those amenities would be a must for anybody who had a serious business. So it's probably not the primary reason, but it is part of it, certainly.
So if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. I should be able to. Jim, another question. Do you think people are still moonshining today?
Oh, absolutely. But I don't think they're moonshining and selling it illegal to the extent, because the retail places are, there's a lot of oversight today. I think it would be hard to sneak it in, and most people just charge more and get the money they need to turn a profit.
Right. And there's so many hobbies now today, right? Like people craft beer and making their own wine.
And they allow you to make, enough for yourself at home. So, I mean, the market is diversified a lot.
Yeah. And I don't know if a lot of people realize or caught that point that when prohibition ended and people were still getting arrested, it's because they had become to depend on those monies that they were making during prohibition. So, but now they're just prohibition ended, but they're still selling alcohol illegally. And the federal government wasn't getting their tax money. So arrests were still going after prohibition ended.
All righty.
Other questions? Okay. There's no other questions. We're going to call it an evening. I'm so glad Jim could finally breathe.
Yeah. There's a lot. I went 75 minutes.
With very few breaths. So we thank everyone for joining us. We have one more this Zoom season that we'll be sending out publicity on, but we really appreciate you joining us for this one, and we'll see you next time. Have a good evening.